Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So earlier today, I tried to record this live stream and I had some technical difficulties. There were problems with my internet connection. So I'm going to redo the video right now during my lunch break. And I hope that people are able to join me now. If not, hopefully people will catch this on the playback. But this was so important that I felt the need to discuss it. In the description box, I will post a link to the House Judiciary's hearing on reparations so that you all can see the hearing for yourself if you have not seen it. Now, this hearing lasts a little over 3 hours and is well worth the time. This is a historic conversation that's long overdue, and hopefully action will be taken on H.R. 40. That's the whole point behind the hearing. And I hope that all these people that are on here advocating for ADOS, I hope that you all push hard for the passage of H.R. 40. Now, hopefully you all are able to hear me. It's raining out here, so hopefully that's not too much of a distraction from this video. But, this is something that's very important. So you had key people participate in this hearing. You had Senator Cory Booker testify. You had Ta-Nehisi Coates testify, and you had a host of others, including Danny Glover. And I'm going to go through some of the things that many of the people said during this hearing. I'm going to provide my brief response to some of the things that were said. So I hope that you all can bear with me, rock with me, share this video with your friends and family. And also subscribe. If you are not subscribed to this channel, please subscribe now. If you notice any kind of technical difficulties as we are proceeding, please let me know. So let's get into it. First of all, I have to commend John Conyers for having the courage, the conviction, and the tenacity to put forth, this H.R. 40 legislation for year after year. For 30 years, this brother has been in the fight for reparations, pushing this issue. It's unfortunate that it has made no progress and hasn't been passed in all this time, but the brother has to be commended for his effort. He was involved in this well before you had this ADOS trend on the internet. So this brother deserves respect. And also I have to shout out Sheila Jackson Lee, the representative from Texas, for bringing this back before Congress and for setting up this hearing that took place yesterday. It's very important. This legislation is important to the future of the Black community in this country. It is important to the future of this nation. And I have to commend the sister for pushing hard on this issue. And also this sister made some powerful statements about reparations during that hearing yesterday. She talked about how because of slavery, this country was enriched. She talked about how we created the wealth for this nation and how we need to be compensated for doing so. Now, I'm not going to summarize every single thing that all the speakers had to say during the hearing, because again, the hearing lasted for like 3 hours. But what I'm going to do is just point out some of the highlights to this particular hearing. And of all the people that spoke, Ta-Nehisi Coates gave the most compelling testimony. Each of them were given like 5 minutes to make a statement about what they observed, about their, position on reparations. And this brother, in that brief period of time, he provided a strong and solid rebuttal to Mitch McConnell. Shout out to sister, shout out to everybody that's tuning in. Shout out to Hollow Ninja. Hopefully you all are able to hear me. It's raining, so you're gonna hear background noise from the rain. But I hope that you all can bear with me because this is a very important matter that needs to be discussed. So the brother Ta-Nehisi Coates, out of all the people that spoke, he gave the most compelling statement. And what I'm going to do is just read some excerpts from his statement. And these excerpts, and the whole statement itself will be available in the description box. I will have a link in the description box letting you all have an opportunity to read the whole statement for yourself. So just bear with me a second. I'm going to take the article and just read a couple of excerpts from it. Hopefully people are able to hear me. Hopefully this rain is not too much of a distraction. So one of the points that he responded to is some statements that Mitch McConnell made. Now, Mitch McConnell is the majority leader in the Senate. He's a Republican. He made some statements against reparation. And as you all know, I did a video response to Mitch McConnell, and I'm glad that Hollow Ninja told me he can hear fine. So I'm just going to keep pressing ahead despite this background noise. So Mitch McConnell basically made this point. Like he said, well, slavery was 150 years ago. None of the victims of slavery are still alive. None of the slave masters are alive now. So basically there's no need for reparations. And he also made some other outlandish statements that I addressed in my video response to Mitch McConnell. But in response to that, Ta-Nehisi Coates said this. He said, the United States is still paying out pensions to the heirs of civil rights soldiers. So how can we make this claim that because the actual victims are no longer alive, or because people are no longer alive, then they should, there should be no compensation when we have this example of civil war warriors still receiving pension, their heirs still receiving pensions. So we can't make that argument that people shouldn't be entitled to compensation based on, what their descendants had done or anything like that. And then he also pointed out this. He said, we honor treaties that date back some 200 years despite no one being alive who signed those treaties. Another compelling point. And the brother Ta-Nehisi Coates also talked about this. He said that for a century after the Civil War, black people were subjected to a relentless campaign of terror, a campaign that extended well into the lifetime of Majority Leader McConnell. Again, this push for reparations is not just about slavery. It's also about Jim Crow. For years, black people were denied the opportunity to build wealth. They were denied civil and human rights in this country, and black people were terrorized. As this brother Ta-Nehisi Coates points out, and this type of action is not something that happened a gazillion years ago. Many of the victims of Jim Crow are alive today. Many of our parents were alive during the Jim Crow era. Our grandparents were alive during the Jim Crow era. So that argument about not being compensated for reparations because people are no longer alive falls flat when you point out how it's just not only about slavery, it's also about living victims of the Jim Crow era. He talks about how, there were racist GI bills, poll taxes, and all this kind of stuff. And he cited how Mitch McConnell was alive when George Stinney was electrocuted to death, when he was subjected to the death penalty. Mitch McConnell was alive. And if I'm not mistaken, that's the case where you had a 14-year-old boy electrocuted, killed by the state. And then he also mentioned this. He said he was alive for the blinding of Isaac Woodward. He was alive for the kleptocracy in his native Alabama, a regime premised on electoral theft. So he cited these examples. He said he was alive for the redlining of Chicago and the looting of black homeowners of some $4 billion. The brother also went on to point out the wealth disparity that traces back to not only slavery, but to the Jim Crow era. Many of us are disproportionately poor, disproportionately lacking in wealth and resources as a direct result of the Jim Crow era in terms of redlining, in terms of black people being denied the opportunity to build wealth through home ownership, the problem of predatory lending practices that took place during the Jim Crow era, and even today. So this brother points out all this stuff. And he talks about how basically people want to be fair weather patriots, where they only want to acknowledge the positive things of America's past, but they want to ignore all the negative things that exist in America's past. He said in H.R. 40, this body has a chance to make good on its 2009 apology for enslavement and reject fair weather patriotism to say that this nation is both its credits and its debits. That if Thomas Jefferson matters, so does Sally Hemings. That if D-Day matters, so does Black Wall Street. So this brother laid it out. He made it plain. And I'm glad that he was there for that hearing. Now, I want to talk about some of the other things that were said during this hearing. Before I get into like what some of the black activists and scholars had to say, I want to talk about what one of the representatives had to say. This representative by the name of Johnson. He's from the South. If I'm not mistaken, I think he's from Louisiana. This man opened up this whole session by talking about how much he opposes reparations. I'm gonna cut on my car for a second so the air conditioning can come on. Hopefully it won't make too much noise. Hold on one second. Okay, that beeping stopped. I'm gonna keep it low so it won't make too much noise. But basically you had this representative try to undermine this whole push for reparations. And he did it by making several statements. First of all, he talked about reparations would be found to be unconstitutional if Congress enacted it. Before there's even been any kind of study, before a passage of a law that calls for a study, you had this white man basically trying to shoot down the idea by predicting what the Supreme Court is going to decide. As far as I'm concerned, those type of legal issues are issues that should be taken up by the committee that will be established if H.R. 40 is passed. That committee can look into the legality of various proposed remedies or proposed forms of compensation. That committee can look at those legal issues and determine whether or not it'll pass legal muster or determine the best route to go that will be constitutional and all that kind of stuff. The idea should not be nipped in the bud by some white congressman before it's even had a chance to be studied. You know, another point that this man made is he basically said that slave owners were in the minority and that many white people came to this country after slavery. They are immigrants to this country and they had nothing to do with slavery, and basically they should not have to pay for slavery. And I understand his argument, but the fact of the matter is it extends beyond just the individual families that participated in the slave trade. Every single facet of this society profited from the slave trade, the North and the South, as was pointed out by one of the panelists, Katrina Brown. The North benefited in many ways from the slave trade. You know, people in the North were enslaved. Later it was abolished earlier than the South, but still the North profited from the slave trade. It sold the cotton, it used the cotton from the South. It sold products to the slave-holding South. It benefited from slavery. This nation benefited. You know, this federal government benefited from slavery. This government used slave labor to build the nation's monuments, to build the Capitol building. Insurance companies benefited from slavery. Banks benefited from slavery. Many of these wealthy families in this country benefited from the enslavement of our ancestors. And they still enjoy unjust enrichment today. And because of that, uh, they are responsible for the current day conditions. They are responsible for the massive wealth disparities between black people and white people. And because they have the riches that they have enjoyed because of the suffering of our ancestors, they enjoy wealth today, not yesterday, today, wealth built on the oppression of our people, built on the continuing disparities of our people. And because of that, they need to pay up. I don't care what this representative is talking about. And then, he made the argument about self-reliance and the need for black people to take control over their own destiny and all that kind of stuff. And to some degree, I understand. Of course, black people need to be self-reliant and all that kind of stuff. Of course, that's something that black people have been pushing for. But we have also been pushing for justice. Nobody makes that argument to the Jews who were subjected to genocide in Germany. Nobody tells them that they need to be self-reliant, that they need to forget about the Holocaust. Nobody tells them that. Nobody tells the people that were put in those Japanese internment camps that they need to just be self-reliant and they need to not demand justice. We must demand justice. We must demand reparations, not just for, the suffering of our ancestors, but for the continuing disparities and institutional and structural racism that impacts us today as a direct result of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. So, this push for reparations is a righteous cause that we all need to be a part of. So now I want to go into what some of the people had to say. And unfortunately, I'm not going to have much time right now to get to your comments. Shout out to Bonafide 1970. Shout out to the brother for tuning in. And again, I got to thank you for coming out to my art show and sale. Eventually, I will post video footage from that art show and sale and also photographs, a slideshow so you all can see it. And I plan to have another art show next year as well. So I will keep you all posted on that. But anyway, during this reparations hearing, you also had Cory Booker make some statements. And as you all know, he's a U.S. Senator from New Jersey. He's running for president. So he made statements in support of reparations. And I'm glad that a major candidate like him has voiced support for reparations. I think that is a positive development. And it's only because of the pressure that people are putting on these politicians. And to some degree, I have to give some respect to the ADOS movement, even though I vehemently disagree with them on many issues, as you all know. But I have to give them props for being one of the groups that have been putting pressure on these politicians to address this question of reparations. But as I listened to Cory Booker, it became clear to me that basically you had a situation of grandstanding. You had a situation of somebody basically being disingenuous, somebody that's making statements solely to win over African Americans in this primary so that he can become the nominee for the Democratic Party. That's all that I saw in his statements. That's the vibe that I got from him as I listened to him. Here's a man that talked about like a lot of current conditions that our people are facing. And of course, that's relevant, that's necessary. But in his statements, he didn't draw the connections between those current day conditions and this issue of reparations. And I think that was a missed opportunity. He came across as insincere and phony. I mean, he is a phony politician. One of these people that want to pretend like they're down for the people so that they can get votes and all that kind of stuff. This guy, for a while, he lived in the projects to make some kind of political point and to win over people. And I think that while in some respects you can say it's commendable, was that somebody from his background would decide to embrace the hood and stuff like that, but it was for political expediency, for political purposes. This man, with all his wealth, so hot that it automatically shut down. So hopefully, you all are still tuning in. Sorry about that. Hopefully, it is cold enough in this car for and not to shut down again. So just bear with me a second. I'm probably going to have to hold it right here near this air conditioning. And hopefully this air conditioning is not too loud for you all. So let's continue on. So I was talking about how Cory Booker is not sincere. And the reason why I said that is because basically, I mean, you have a situation where this guy goes to live in the projects, even though he's some, uh, Ivy League educated lawyer and stuff. It's clear that his only intent in living in the projects is to um, win over political points. His only intent to go to Newark to live, even though he's some wealthy person, is some, Ivy League educated person, was so that he could win um, an election and become the mayor of Newark and eventually go on to do what he's doing now. So he's a man that just doesn't seem sincere at all. He's a man that's all about politics. It's not about a sincere push for reparations or a sincere desire for reparations. That's just the vibe that I got from him, listening to him um, testify during that hearing. Now, there's a couple of other points that I want to talk about, and that's this. I mean, there were a couple of people at this hearing that shouldn't have been at the hearing, period. Some of those people that were at the hearing were straight up cooning, cooning for biscuits, cooning for a pat on the head, basically uh, selling out, man, tap dancing. And one of those people is a former NFL player by the name of Burgess Owens. That man deserves the Coon of the Year award. The first thing out of his mouth was that this is not about black and white. Anytime somebody says this is not about black and white, believe it. Believe me, that issue that they're talking about is all about black and white. That issue is all about race. That's a comment that people make in order to make white people feel comfortable, to make them feel okay, to make them feel like they're in a safe space. That's a comment that people make when they don't want to address the very real issue of racism. And that's how this guy started out his comments. Instead of addressing the issue of reparations, this man went on and on about how racist the Democrats were in the past, as if that has anything at all to do with reparations. He turned the discussion about reparations into some partisan discussion about who's better, Republicans or Democrats. This guy also brought up some other irrelevant nonsense. These Trump talking points about immigration and how immigration is hurting the African American community. This man went into a discussion about abortions. This man went into a discussion about um, misogyny and stuff. That stuff has absolutely nothing to do with the question of reparations. And his whole purpose in being there was to distract, was to deflect, and was to take the discussion off the rails and completely off topic. That's what he was there to do. And he was also there to undermine the whole push for reparations. This man didn't present any kind of solid arguments against reparations. All this man did was shuck and jive and try to change the subject. Shout out to old Sheila. Thanks for tuning in. So I had to talk about that, man. Everything that this man was talking about was just about completely irrelevant to the subject matter at hand. And, he has to be called out. This man was basically playing the role of Steven from Django. This man was playing the role of Sambo. This man was playing the role of Step It, Fetch It. And he's too dumb to realize that that's what he was doing. And this is another reason why I just have a problem with these hearings that are set up. The problem that I have with these hearings is the fact that you have both parties that are able to invite, people to serve on these panels. And often what Republicans do is they invite these coons to be on these panels. These coons that don't deserve to be on these panels. These coons that have nothing of substance to add to the discussion. That's what they do. Just like when they invited Candace Owens on another panel dealing with white supremacy. Inviting these buffoons on these panels to take away from very real and necessary discussion. This man, Burgess Owens shouldn't have been on the panel. And then they also have this other coon on there by the name of Coleman Hughes, this young writer who's getting all this praise. And I wouldn't be surprised if after this hearing, this guy doesn't become some kind of superstar among the far right. This guy claimed to be a Democrat while pushing against reparations, pushing hard against reparations. His first criticism against HR 40 was the fact that HR 40 deals with reparations, and he claimed that it doesn't address modern day problems. And he basically says that, the current day issues are being neglected in order to embrace the problems of the past or to deal with the problems of the past. And I think that he's flat out wrong. First of all, his statements are premature because we don't know what kind of proposals the HR 40 committee would come up with to address this question of reparations. I'm sure that these current day problems will be addressed in any push for reparations because there are connections to these current day problems, connections that people like him refuse to acknowledge. And one of the most disappointing things about what Coleman Hughes had to say is this. He tried to downplay disparities, between African Americans and white Americans. There are massive disparities between African Americans and white Americans. Disparities in healthcare, disparities in sentencing, disparities in incarceration, disparities in police brutality, disparities in wealth, all kinds of disparities. But this man wants to downplay those disparities by absolving society of its responsibility, basically suggesting that it's not society's fault. It's the black community's fault. It's because of inherent differences between groups of people. And to bring home this point, this guy cited the examples of, various disparities among various types of white people. He also cited disparities between African Americans and black immigrants, to bring home this point that it's not necessarily about this society. The society could be egalitarian, but still you're going to have these disparities. Even if you were to assume that there will be some disparities regardless of the nature of society, the disparities wouldn't be this drastic. The disparities between the black community and the white community are rooted in a long history of discrimination against African Americans, a history that goes back to slavery, a history that goes back to Jim Crow, a history that is still with us today, not something of the past. Um, so these massive disparities are not just some coincidence as a result of culture. These are a result of systemic and structural racism that continues to exist today. And that's something that this young man, this young coon, failed to acknowledge and realize. And, one thing that I have to touch on is that this is a prime example of the educated fool. This is the prime example of the miseducation of the Negro that Carter G. Woodson talked about. The miseducation of the Negro, that's what you have here. You have a situation where you have a young man with all this Ivy League education, which has led to nothing but miseducation. He's so educated that he has become a fool. He's so educated that he's become a useful tool of white supremacy and isn't smart enough to realize that that's, in fact, what he is. So, another point that this young guy made was this. He said that all African Americans shouldn't receive reparations. And the reason why he made this argument is because, according to him, um, basically, you have some African Americans that are privileged, some African Americans that are middle class or wealthy, and because of that, they should not receive reparations. And he basically used that to undermine this argument for reparations. And the thing that he's ignoring, as Julianne Malveaux pointed out, is this. This is not about single individuals. This is about a system. This is about structural racism that impacts large numbers of people. Just because you have a few people that have made it, quote unquote, made it, that doesn't mean that reparations isn't a valid idea. That does not mean that even those who have, quote unquote, made it should not be compensated or should not be receive some form of reparations. I think that that was a disingenuous and ridiculous argument. And as Ta-Nehisi Coates pointed out, even when black people have quote unquote made it, there are still great disparities between them and white people. He pointed out how a black person that makes all this like $100,000 a year or whatever is living in the same neighborhood as a white person making only $30,000 a year. Another example of disparities. Even though somebody is in the quote unquote middle class in the black community, they still have less wealth than their white counterpart. These are things that this guy, Coleman Hughes, ignored in his analysis or just simply was ignorant of. So you got people like this guy, Hughes. His name is Coleman, so I think about the jazz artist Hawkins. I'm sorry about that. But Hughes, this is the thing that these people don't understand. People like him simply shouldn't have been on the panel. They detracted from the discussion. People like that, Kuhn, Owen, shouldn't have been on the panel. Instead, people that were in the audience, some of them should have been on the panel. People like Hillary Shelton, the Washington Bureau Director for the NAACP. People like Eiffel should have been on the panel. The president, of LDF should have been on the panel. Ron Daniels should have been on the panel. People like Ray Winbush should have been on the panel. That brother wrote many things about reparations. He's been one of the key advocates for reparations. He should have been on the panel. There are people like Randall Robinson should have been on this panel. They have been a part of the discussion for reparations for a very long time, and they deserved a place on that panel. They should have been on that panel. Another person that provided strong, compelling testimony during that reparations hearing was the sister Julianne Malveaux. And I mentioned some of the things that she had to say. She focused on the economic issues. She's an economist. She talked about like the wealth disparities between black people and white people. She made some very strong points about how that disparity is rooted in slavery and Jim Crow. And she also addressed the fact that it's not about whether or not all white people own slaves. The facts of the matter is whites, period, in the American society in general have benefited from slavery. They have benefited from the unjust enrichment of, they benefited. They benefited and they've become unjustly rich as a result of slavery. And I'm glad that this sister brought home that point. Another thing that I want to address is like throughout the discussion, you had some people that were trying to placate these white people. People like, that Kuhn Owens, people like that guy, Coleman Hughes, and also people like this pastor who made statements in support of reparations. He talked about how he supported reparations, but from what I understand, he's a leader of a particular religious church, Christian denomination that's primarily white, So a lot of his talking points were designed to make white people comfortable with the idea of reparations. And I take issue with some of the things that he had to say. He kept talking about like the need to for people to get right with their souls and their hearts and all that kind of stuff. Making all these touchy feely type of statements. Things that would appeal to your bleeding heart white liberal. And, to some degree, it makes sense to do that, but it comes across weak. It comes across soft. And that's what that guy projected. He projected weakness. He projected, you know, just being soft, man. That's what he projected to me. And I'm not impressed with that. That doesn't impress me. I'm impressed with men speaking truth to power, people, period, women speaking truth to power. Speaking up, as Sister Soldier said, with authority and conviction, and not like being mealy mouthed and soft in their words and stuff like that. So that's one problem that I had. He said things like white people need reparations more than black people in order to appeal to these white people. That's absolutely ridiculous. We are the ones that need the reparations more than anybody else. All these years that we've been denied justice, all these massive disparities that exist because of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. We are the ones that need reparations. We need it for ourselves and we need it for our ancestors who died during the Middle Passage. Over 1 million black people died during the Middle Passage. All those people that were stuffed in those slave ships, beaten, raped, abused in every single imaginable way, stripped, their families ripped apart, stripped of their identity, stripped of their languages, their culture, and their religions. To this day, many of us don't even know what tribes we belong to. Many of us don't even know what countries, specific countries in Africa we come from, what language we spoke. We don't even know we don't even know our traditional religions and stuff like that. Our identity has been warped and changed in fundamental ways, and that still impacts us today because of slavery. So we are the ones that need slavery more than anyone else, despite what this Negro was saying, man. And you had a lot of people also trying to placate these. And then another, before I go on to that other point, let me address this. You had this guy talking about we have forgiven white people for slavery, making some blanket statement about black people forgiving white people for slavery. And I'm like, how in the hell are you going to speak for an entire race? Talking about we forgave these white people for the enslavement of our ancestors. To hell with that. We haven't forgiven them for the brutality, the most horrific crime that was committed in human history. To hell with that. We didn't forgive them for that. For all the millions of black people killed during slavery. We don't forgive them for that. We don't forgive them for the all the beatings and the rapings and all the stripping of our culture. We don't forgive these people for that, especially since they have not even um, compensated, made any kind of effort at all to compensate for the enslavement of our ancestors. To hell with that. It took them so long to even issue a half-hearted apology. And you got this tap dancing Negro talking about we forgive these people for the enslavement of our ancestors. To hell with that, man. This is just another example of how some people have become so delusional because of religion, the distorted interpretation of religion. They become so sissified and weak because of their misinterpretation of religion, that you have this man talking about we done forgiven these people for this horrific crime, even though these people have not made amends for it. Yeah, so I just had to express my outrage about that. And I'm gonna have to wrap this up soon, man, because I got to get back to work. Another thing is this: you had all these people basically trying to tap dance and placate these white people by saying, well, it's not about cutting checks. It's not about cutting checks. It's not about cutting checks. And I'm glad that brother Ta-Nehisi Coates said, we're not ruling out, cutting checks out. This is a financial thing after all. Our people did work for free for hundreds of years, man. These people got rich off of our enslavement. There has to be some kind of financial dimension to reparations. Reparations is not just about cutting checks, but cutting checks has to be a part of it. It has to be. And we should not be negotiating against ourselves before the negotiations have even started. You got black people negotiating against themselves, already negotiating out compensation before discussions have even started, before there has even been a study. And I think that that's a foolish tactic. I don't think that that makes any kind of sense. So I had to, raise that point. Um, and I'm going to touch on a couple of other points before I go. Danny Glover was there. I'm glad the brother, as somebody that's in a position of prominence, as an actor, somebody known in Hollywood, I'm glad he was there to lend his voice to this issue. I think that that was very important. Um, that's very important. I don't think that he provided strong, compelling testimony necessarily, but I think that he did bring attention to this issue. His mere presence alone is something that's worthy. Um, so I won't say much more about what the brother had to say. I won't, disrespect the brother. Much respect to him for even showing up. But I think that other people should have been invited to the table, as I mentioned earlier. And then you had this woman by the name of Katrina Brown speak, and I've mentioned her briefly before. This woman found out that her ancestors owned slaves. In fact, they were one of the families that uh, was engaged in the slave trade more than just about anybody, from what I understand. And she was, from what I understand, she's done books about reparations and talked about reparations, and that's good. And she was there supporting HR 40, and that's a positive thing. But my question to her is, are you going to compensate the people that your ancestors enslaved? Are you going to compensate the people that you still enjoy some degree of wealth as a result of their enslavement? Are you going to compensate them? Are you going to give them reparations from your own wealth? That's what I want to know from her. It's one thing to support HR 40. That's a good thing. It's one thing to do books about slavery. That's a good thing. It's quite another thing to compensate those enslaved Africans who were enslaved by your ancestors, who you have benefited from. You've benefited from the enslavement of them, because I'm sure that your ancestors passed on their wealth to you. So it's time for you to pay up too. Um, and yes, if people have information about what she's done for African Americans in terms of trying to make amends or compensation, I would be interested in hearing that. Leave that comment in the comment section to this video. And the last point that I want to make is this, and that's the importance of electoral politics and its connection to reparations. I mean, you have people like Tariq Nasheed, claiming to be interested in reparations. You have people like, a lot of these people, you know, um, people like Cynthia G, people like Robert Perkins, and the list goes on and on. All these people that think voting is, irrelevant, think that voting is not an effective strategy to affect change. These same people that take this position are the same people pushing for reparations. Don't they realize that it takes an act of Congress for any kind of reparations to become possible for the most part? I mean, now you could have some private company decide, well, out of the generosity or under pressure to voluntarily make some kind of payments. But for the most part, something like reparations requires the actions of government, of elected officials. And if you expect reparations to actually become a reality, you have to elect politicians that support reparations, that push for reparations. That's what you have to do. And you can't do that if you are running around here like some fool telling black people they need to hold back their vote and not vote. This fool, Tariq Nasheed, actually had a don't vote campaign. But yet and still, he's on here day in and day out talking about reparations. But he's the same person that told you that elections were irrelevant. He's the same person that told you to sit out the election. People like that need to be ashamed of themselves, and they need to be called out on their bullshit and on their hypocrisy, man. And I'm going to do it every time. I don't care if people like it or don't like it. You know, these same people that want to complain about how racist Donald Trump is are the same people that told you that elections don't matter. These are the same people that told you to participate in that ridiculous don't vote campaign. At a time when we had these crucial midterm elections, people like this Tariq Nasheed buffoon were on here telling you and me not to vote, that our vote, you know, we shouldn't be voting and it's not that important and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just like disgusted by that, man. Because if you don't vote, how are you going to elect candidates that actually, politicians that actually support reparations? So that's one thing. And then the other thing is this: like for all the people that are ADOS, you know, that are part of that ADOS movement that are so in favor of reparations, instead of getting on here, you know, just commenting on these videos, you know, just giving money to Yvette Carnell and all these other ADOS people, you need to get on the phone and you need to be calling your politician and demanding that they support HR 40. That's what you need to be doing. That's what you need to do. And that's what I'm going to do. And when I get a chance, I'm going to post a link in the description box to your senators and congresspeople's information so that you can go out and call them today. Because without HR 40, reparations is not even a possibility. We need to get HR 40 passed. 30 years is way too long. We've been waiting long enough. We need reparations now. And that's what you all need to be pushing for. So with that, I want to say peace and blessings to each and every one of you. I want to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for bearing with your brother through the rain noise and through the phone shutting off in the middle of the live stream. Have to give you all your props for hanging in there with me. And also, before I go, I want to remind you that I'm going to have a discussion here on YouTube about the book Kindred. Now, I have rescheduled that discussion for sometime in July. When I get a chance, you know, I'll post a link to my my Facebook invite for the people that are in the Maryland area, people that are able to actually come out and meet me in person and talk with me in person about this book. So that's going to be a discussion that's going to be at this popular restaurant here in Baltimore that is black owned. It's a great spot. So we can just chop it up over some great food and great drinks. I will post that link in the description box and in the comment section for you all. So hopefully you all can join me. Again, I have to shout out the brother Bonafide 1970 for showing up to my art show. Have to shout out the sister S. Wiseman for coming out to my art show and say it was great meeting you all in person. Much respect. Salute to you. So with that, peace and blessings to everyone. I hope that you all have a great day. And when I get a chance, I'm going to have to edit out the section that where the phone went out. So with that,